So I've had a couple of ideas for a few videos I want to make, but it's not really like my other videos where it's focused on one piece of media. In fact, talking about one piece of media would actually make the way I talk about it limiting. What I want to talk about are mostly just tropes, but they're tropes beyond what the writer wants to convey in a story itself. There's always someone behind the creator that formats a story for an intended effect. An editor, an animator, or a set designer. These creative concepts are crucial, but also kind of invisible to an audience. So it's interesting to break down and figure out what makes it work. A creator has their own toolbox, but it's nice to understand what's in other toolboxes to get the job done and done well. I'm mostly going to stick to animation and animation adjacent topics of these because that's my thing, but I might stray off the path. But I was really thinking about how to start this though. I mean, how do you start a series of topics? Do you start about how to start a video? That seems uninteresting to me. I'm just really not sure how to make my first video in this format and introduce myself at the same time. Wait, introduce? Wait, that's it! Character introductions, let's talk about it. First impressions are really important. They're not the end-all be-all of a brand new relationship, but a good first impression can do a lot to give someone a decent understanding about who they are. After all, every person's different. A clean introduction can only happen once, and that's at the very beginning. A character can never really unintroduce themselves to someone because it's based on our knowledge and past experiences. Unless the character's an amnesia story, which is not ideal. When two characters meet, there's very little understanding or knowledge of each other. Each of them have gone through experiences and developments the other hasn't seen, so there's an inherent assumption a person makes. Each will assume the other character has had experiences and thoughts like themselves, and therefore assume they act and think in a way similar to how they as a character would. But after introduction, the characters can really get an understanding of a person's thoughts and feelings based on the way they choose to interact and recognizing their priorities through conversation. A cat owner will assume everybody loves cats until they meet a person who's a bigger fan of dogs. Language isn't the only way characters can learn about each other. The characters can get a sense of another from how they compose themselves. If they're excitable and very physical in how they interact with people, it communicates high energy and not the strongest practice of boundaries. If they're very calm and harsh, it can communicate their central focus and wariness of others. So there's two main ways a character introduction can happen, and they each depend on who the character is being introduced to. I've noticed that character introductions can be diegetic or non-diegetic. Diegetic, by its definition, means it's happening in story, and the characters are able to experience the occurrence. Non-diegetic means it's happening for the purposes of the story, but it's not directly happening in a way that interacts with the story itself. Diegetic and non-diegetic are terms mostly used to categorize different sounds for film or TV. The ominous music playing in the background of this guy with an evil look in his eye is something the audience is fully aware of, but the characters have no clue what's up. Yet the heavy footsteps from a corridor the protagonist is running away from is definitely something they're able to hear. Over time, these terms have evolved from being convenient shorthand to other descriptions to other occurrences that aren't just audio. Now, diegetically, there's three main ways characters will be introduced to one another, and it all depends on one thing. Do the characters want to introduce themselves? See, the story introduces characters for them to have interactions and to play on one another for a really engaging narrative. The story has already demanded they will be meeting by the simple fact that we know who these characters are and they're relevant to the main story. If they weren't important to the main story, they wouldn't be introduced at all. So let's start simple. Both or one of these characters want to introduce themselves. A royal, bored by the various suitors arranged and obsessing over them, has their eye caught on the one person who isn't quite acting the way every other suitor is behaving. The character doesn't acknowledge their presence at all and instead admires the world they live in as if they've only seen it once. Our royal wants to be introduced to this person that's so clearly unlike anyone they've ever seen. A main character might have something special about them that nobody the alternative character, who is typically of the supernatural or fantastical variety, has encountered. If they could read everyone's mind or charm everyone effortlessly except for one person, that one person is going to stand out amongst the rest. Stories will want to document the personal life of a character or person, to capture the turmoil and experiences they've gone through and the lowest of their lows to their highest of their highs. So the characters might diegetically introduce themselves in a formal way to a recording device, maybe a camera, to introduce who they are and what they've been through. Other times there's way too many characters to introduce without it feeling like a checklist to then get dull and boring. So musicals will often have a song that introduces each one of our major characters and who they are in the world of story, and perhaps why our protagonist is so different from all of them. Characters could be introduced to each other by the results of their action. A character could see a work the other character has done, whether artistically or not, and be intrigued in them enough to anticipate being introduced. And not every character introduction has to be a human character. Some characters are either animals or creatures the character is being introduced to for the first time, and characters will often have a preconceived idea of the creature and either the dangers of them or their sweet nature, either of which could entirely not be true and subverted later for either empathy or comedy. Upon an introduction to a creature character, the creator will try to have the creature character speak to convey clearly their personality and thoughts, resonating more directly to the audience. Or they can have the creature not have the ability to speak, and instead the character's preconceived notions of this type of creature intersects with their actual experience of being introduced to a live version of the creature, and perhaps to consider their preconceived notion of the species. The latter type of introduction encourages and demands communication of a non-linguistic variety. Okay, but that's if the characters want to be introduced to each other. But what if they don't want to? The story demands they connect with each other and communicate different ideas and experiences, but characters unwilling to be introduced to each other either have a very good reason or a misunderstanding. But just because the characters don't want to meet doesn't mean the narrative has to listen. A pair of characters with either one or both of them absolutely unwilling to introduce themselves is prime for drama, tension, and a blooming companionship. Forced proximity is that compelling people. A character disillusioned and fed up by the real culpable world actions of our very charismatic character cannot be allured by their charm and not want to interact with them based on the knowledge they have in their heads. The charismatic character, often chased and accosted by what feels like everyone within a 5-kilometer radius, is refreshed by someone who doesn't care about their status or allure, and will be intrigued and want to learn more about them after this introduction, much to the dismay of the uninterested character. Characters who are meeting for the first time could be revealed to actually have met before, and had a terrible first initial introduction that is the basis for them having so much animosity between them. The grudge they've held on for so long on the implication that it was personal beef with each other, as opposed to them having certain internal struggles at the time and being unable to navigate conversations in a sincere way. But aside from arguably one of the most popular contemporary romance story tropes, there are other more haunted versions of why they don't want to introduce themselves to new people around them. Oftentimes, this is because our character is a lone wolf who refuses to introduce themselves or get themselves acquainted with others. They have a specific goal in mind, and nothing they can do will change that. It doesn't matter who decides to barge into their path, nothing will throw them off course, and anyone silly enough to bother them will flee at the very sight of them by the way they carry themselves. A character our protagonist doesn't want to be introduced to oftentimes might be more than just a character. They represent a concept they've actively been avoiding manifested in physical form, like the concept of death. The protagonist will try to run from being introduced to this character in the hopes to escape them, but the morale either ends tragically where the character keeps running and running and running, or coming to terms with the existence of the character and introducing themselves by no longer running and facing them head on. Sometimes the story introduces a character whose reputation is so incredibly terrifying that every character goes out of their way to avoid being introduced to them. This is a trope known as the dreaded. The threat of this character's reputation precedes them. Both the characters and the audience are built with the threat of this character before we even meet them. The characters anticipate the introduction of the dreaded character because of the destruction they cause to people like them. The characters will do everything in their power not to have the dreaded character appear on their doorstep. The threat of the dreaded isn't going to stop them from doing what they gotta do, but it will make the doings get rough. Other characters, unfamiliar with the reputation and the impact of the dreaded character, will often think one character is overreacting, which is especially heightened if the dreaded turns out to be a chill person on introduction. But if the dreaded character is just as deadly to the character as their reputation is, the introduction to the character will have to fit the bill of a horrifying person beyond all logical survivability and adamant in what they do that the character who dreads becomes terrified on how they will affect the trajectory of their life and schemes. And the third way characters can get introduced to one another is by complete coincidence. Characters might not even be aware that the other character exists, so it's up to the story's demands to bring them together. But just because the story brings them together doesn't necessarily mean they'll react in the way that the story needs them to react. Some stories don't have a diegetic reason for their characters to interact, so they'll be introduced in a hilarious twist of fate, or as a key obstacle and a threat of collateral damage in a smooth sailing mission that the characters have to reevaluate. Characters could get the very wrong impression upon an introduction. A dangerous character with a gun moving slowly but surely towards our protagonist is likely to intimidate the character, and won't really cross their mind that maybe the ominously large guy in a black leather jacket and holding a shotgun is actually someone trying to help them. Oh wait, romance tropes! The most common one of all! Meet cutes! A meet cute is when two characters meet in a way that establishes a sweet bond between them for a budding connection. Typically, a meet cute is most common in stories with romance in them. It's filled with awkwardness and embarrassment that these characters kind of power through because of how allured and intrigued they are by each other. As long as there's an inherent cuteness, awkwardness, and humorous factor about it, it's a really sweet version of this kind of introduction. But there can also be an extreme level of horror to not knowing each other's existence. A character who takes the place of another could be entirely different from the person our protagonists have in their mind, so it's a mental adjustment that this is a new character and not the one they desperately miss. The character who comes to life and takes the place of a long gone character will often be a bit more naive than the original character, and the character who has the memory of the person that isn't here anymore has to realize that this is a different person than the one they knew before. So it's important to distinguish the intent of characters when meeting, and a narrative will often force them to meet regardless of whether or not they choose to. But there's only one real instance where the character wants to be introduced to another, but the narrative denies them of this. And that's when the character has no idea who exactly a specific character is that's important to them, but they want to meet them anyways. This is typically in stories that involve mourning or abandonment. A young character that didn't get introduced to the characters they should have a close bond with is someone they desperately want to meet. They want to know who they were, the connection they could have had, the weird quirks everyone talks about consistently. This is often the case with parental figures who passed either before our protagonist could form long-term memories, or they passed on as the character was born. And about abandonment, a character might want to be introduced to characters that abandoned them. They were a result of someone's connection, and realizing they never got to know who brought them to this world and the life they could have had with someone who actively chose to let them behind. This can cause a rift between the character and the people they care about now. It often tunnel visions them to try and find who their quote-unquote real family is. The characters around them will often be hurt that the abandoned character doesn't value their relationship with them and instead is focused more on finding these answers for closure and potentially kindling a relationship to deal with their misconceptions about their self-worth. Typically, through the progression of the story, the character will come to the realization that they don't need to be introduced to the person who abandoned them because they've grown and connected with people. It's not about introducing themselves to someone and experience the what could have beens and what ifs of the past, but instead enjoying the now and the promise of the future our characters are living in with the people who choose to care for them. And even if the character does find the character who abandoned them, it doesn't necessarily mean they're there. An abandoner could have been long gone by the time our character finds them, but the character can still find closure in seeing the character who abandoned them and getting answers from the people who knew them. The introduction to the abandoned character and why they abandoned the protagonist is far more important than the rekindling of their relationship, but it can also make them mourn if circumstances beyond either of them was the reason why they couldn't have this relationship in the first place. The lack of memory of this character will be something our protagonist cannot change. Abandonment is not always a guarantee to be resolved. Death is final. There's pathos, sorrow, and catharsis to be had from an introduction, even if what comes after it isn't guaranteed. But even if those characters don't come back, that doesn't mean others can't be introduced back into their lives. The entire emphasis on a diegetic introduction is that the characters haven't met each other before. If characters have already met and are meeting again, we can agree that's not an introduction, it's a reunion, regardless of how close or distant those characters may be to one another, whether physically or personally. The diegetic foreknowledge of one another is key information that determines if it's a reintroduction or not. So to make the character's reintroduction more interesting and dramatic, a story will play on this idea of characters' recollections of each other. A creator can make the memory of these characters be so fundamentally different from when they last met, so they'll often have to be parted for a long period of time. The story can either start with the characters having a diegetic introductions and then later reveal the characters are actually having a reunion, or the story can show their life before the separation and then time skip to the reunion. Either way, the reunion will have two different perspectives based on if they remember each other and who remembers what. If one character remembers the other but the other doesn't, then the audience anticipates the revelation. The character who remembers may feel inferior or terrified that the other has changed so much they might not remember them while they've been holding on to their past connection, or that they do remember them but the other character has had experiences beyond the life they had with the character who remembers that the effort will just look like it's all for naught. If characters don't remember the other or don't recognize each other after getting a drastic redesign since they met, it ends up looping around to a new diegetic introduction. The only question of if this is a reunion or a first encounter is whether the audience is given the information of these two characters meeting. If the audience isn't told that these two characters have met before, then it makes their introduction fresh. They might not trust each other since they have no recollection of ever meeting them and slowly build trust over time. Then, upon the revelation of having met before, it causes a weird mental merge. The characters have spent time to get to know each other independently of the experiences they had before. While they're for all intents and purposes the same character, that doesn't mean a character would treat them the exact same way unless they're aware of this information. How they treat each other before the revelation will change how they view the other. In the character's mind, the other is a different person from the one they remember. So combining what are essentially two different characters in their mind is really difficult, because both these characters have such a strong sense of identity in each other's heads. It's prime for drama and exploration between characters. And this is also how character revelations work. Our protagonists might be hiding something incredibly significant about who they are that other characters around them might not be aware of. So they might take on a different identity to hide behind an alias to use this side of themselves publicly, or hide away this information until they can find a way to rid themselves of their secret. They might think to reveal this part of themselves to the people around them, but the risk might be too great. They could lose the life they have and put their loved ones in danger if the secret gets revealed. But a secret our protagonist desperately wants to hide is too juicy of a character exploration, so it's going to get revealed to those around them and cause a conflict of interest. This is something that the other characters would never imagine our subtly secret protagonists would do, and their secret typically gets revealed by their hand being forced instead of having their own agency. The character who has their secret revealed is reintroduced to the other characters who have had such a strong sense of who the character with the secret was, only for it to be shattered before their very eyes. The other protagonists have discovered this new part to the character with the secret, so it causes a conflict in their minds. This character who they trusted a lot has betrayed them by keeping this huge secret from them, so it betrays the strong bond of trust they had with each other. The character they've trusted has lied. The intention may still be unclear, but the emotional wound of being deceived is strong. The characters have to recontextualize their entire relationship with this person who they thought they had such an honest connection with, only for them to be deceived for what could have been a few days, months, or their entire relationship. It also seems impossible to get more dramatic than that, but there's a way for it to get even juicier. And that's when our story has our reunited characters remember each other from their last meeting, but one of them has changed more than the other realized. The unchanged character is fully aware of who this person was once in their life, but there's been too much that's happened to each of them independently for them to revive their initial dynamic. It's a reunion that introduces the unchanged character to a brand new version of the person they knew. A character spending so much time with the other means they influence the other character with the actions they do, and when they do split apart, one could go through a significant amount of development the other wasn't present for, or to guide them away from, which is either harmful or antithetical to their initial dynamic. The unchanged character upon a reunion will just view the other as the same character they knew before. The idea of who they saw last and the actual person that's in front of them should be the same people. There's no way time has changed them that much. If the changed character is unaware of the change they've experienced, they might fall back into old familiar habits with the unchanged character until some event creates a conflict of interest between the two. It could have been easy to resolve before the initial development they went through, but there's too much our changed character prioritizes over their dynamic with the unchanged character. If the changed character is aware of how different they are from when they last met the unchanged character, it can make them fear the response of the unchanged character to feel disconnected from them since they've gone through such a stark transformation. It's the fear that their change might not live up to the versions of themselves in the unchanged character's mind, especially if the note they parted on when they were younger was very bitter and tragic. But if they both remember each other and have both changed significantly from their previous reunion, does that count as a brand new introduction? They become different characters with differing experiences, motivating to do actions the other would never have thought they'd do. So even if they did have a past together, that doesn't mean they're aware of who each other are anymore. How much of this person is the person they knew? It's a real ship of Theseus question. Even in romance plots, characters may have already been in a platonic relationship with each other up until they realize their own romantic thoughts and feelings. Until that point, they've seen the second character as their good, close personal friend, or someone that just kind of happens to be around. There's a level of familiarity with a character, but then the introduction of romantic feelings changes how the primary character views, and then later, how they interact with the second character. Upon reintroduction to the second character, now being viewed as a viable romantic interest, our primary character might be very direct and determined to engage with the second character romantically, or they could not know how to interact with the second character after coming to the realization and lose their composure in a way that is very odd to people around them, or even the second character. Sometimes characters have a really bad diegetic introduction or experiences, so they may take a moment to formally reintroduce themselves, and to leave those previous assumptions of who they were in the past. It doesn't matter who they were, only who they will be. It's actually one of the most heartwarming moments of a story, for two characters to choose each other and start over, knowing all they've experienced with each other throughout the time they've known the other. And those are all the different kinds of diegetic introductions. They all happen in story and have real lasting consequence between the different characters and the trajectory of the narrative. Non-diegetic introductions, however, focus on how a character gets introduced to the audience. This does feel redundant a bit. Lots of stories introduce us, the audience, to the character with our protagonist first encountering them. Since a lot of stories focus on what the character is experiencing, and by extension, the story guides us to take on the lens of these characters being diegetically introduced to these other characters for the first time. But the medium of the story is being told in doesn't tell every little detail about what's occurred. It's just the main parts. So a creator has to navigate the medium to communicate information to an audience that might not specifically be from our characters' perspectives. Even stories will have cutaways to characters our protagonist might not be aware of. The audience might be introduced to the character before the protagonist even sees them. One non-diegetic way the audience can be introduced to an on-screen character is through staging and cinematography, which tells a lot about the medium of movies and TV. The maneuvering of a camera and how the characters are meant to be staged in relation to the limit of the screen can tell us a lot. If a character is introduced with wide young eyes and a high camera angle, then we're probably meant to sympathize with them initially, since they're too adorable for this sick, sad world. A character with fast movements and me uncomfortably taking up most of the screen, we get the sensation that this character is energetic and has no idea about boundaries. Antagonists cloaked in darkness with their face turned away from the view of the audience hides their eyes and intention. Our protagonist might not be there, but the audience is. The audience can't see their eyes, which holds so much intention behind them. We can't see if they're doing this to their own accord or forced into this role. By using the screen-based medium, the creator can give a lot more information than the audience realizes. It specifically frames the character in a way to give the audience a trajectory of their arc, either for the character to play into the role the staging conveys, or to subvert it later after we learn more information about them. Staging can be used to tell a lot about a character's perspective and internalized thoughts. Non-diegetic backgrounds can say a lot about what they're thinking without any need for dialogue. It's effective in a screen-based medium to convey it's not the diegetic reality that the actual environment themselves are changing, but rather getting into the character's head. Similarly, a musical might have the character introduce themselves with a song. I am songs tell the audience who this character is and what their deal is. It's to get the audience to quickly know the characters without necessarily sympathizing with them. It's just there to introduce the audience to the facts of who they are, and typically for things unchanging in the world or villains. While an I want song focuses on the desires and the personal goals they have for their exploration and narrative. It's supposed to have the audience sympathize with them and get the audience attached. A story can introduce the characters in a montage, which quickly shows their daily routine and strange little quirks they have. The character doesn't often do this in front of other characters, but we can get a hint into who this character is diegetically without characters in proximity. After all, we're not necessarily the same people alone as we are with others. We're not a different person, but our priorities and behaviors may adapt on the knowledge of who's around us. A character will often be a lot more vulnerable when there's no one diegetically there. Introducing a character that's sad when they're alone leads the way for joy arriving by the end of the story. Introducing a character in a happy situation means the character will be tested in their journey to maintaining that happiness. The audience knows who the character is beneath the surface, but that's information conveyed outside of the diegetic story the character is in. And depending on the genre of the story, a character's introduction can determine their narrative importance, especially with the skills they may have. It says a lot about who they are, what they're good at, and how good those abilities they have might be important or irrelevant as far as the genre. If we see a happy character in the early minutes of a story, an audience could have two different reactions to the character based on the genre. If the genre is slice of life, then it's totally chill and fine. That's just how they are in their daily life. But if the genre is horror, the audience becomes tense, fully aware that the story will take a huge turn by the end. A character with medical knowledge might be an attractive quality in a romance story, just another character in a hospital drama, or the most important character in a whodunit mystery. The character's skill would play a huge role in the plot or just fun quirks of their everyday life, and that depends on the story's demand for their skills. The skill level our character is introduced with can establish a very clear trajectory of growth for the story. If the protagonist of a martial arts movie has no clue how to fight and is very clearly untrained for martial arts, it allows for the story to develop the character further in that exploration. If a character is in a survival story, showing them being resourceful makes the survival aspect not be the main focus of the story, but showing the character privileged and not having done a day of survival training in their life means the story will surround them trying to figure out how to live on another day. And the skill level a character has doesn't just translate to their abilities, but how they interact with their environments. A character's familiarity in engaging their environment tells about how they commonly interact with this specific kind of environment. A dangerous environment like a booby-trapped historical site being navigated could tell us how familiar this character is with the day-to-day of historical sites. So it implies they've been here before and interacted with this place enough to the point where its dangerous occurrences are predictable. A character introduced stealthing to an environment will let the audience know that they're not supposed to be there. Being introduced to the character in that environment will immediately create tension. The audience might not know who this character is or even what they're doing, but this efficient means of introduction can hook the audience into making it through this character's objective. And hooking the audience into a story is a very important consideration to the creator. A creator wants an audience to engage with their story, so often they'll do it with a character introduction. Non-diegetic character introductions, by their very nature, is how the character gets introduced to the audience. So it's prime for the story to start with an intense action sequence and the climax of it, and then freeze frame in the voiceover to go, "Yep, that's me." You're probably wondering how I got into this mess. Then the story rewinds to the beginning of the sequence of events that led to that moment. It establishes the tone and genre of the story in what is very easily less than a minute of actual runtime, and gives the audience a clean hook and intrigue to engage with the story to see how the pieces of the puzzle fall together to have us reach that climax. It also conveys to the audience the lax or generally humorous nature of the character to suddenly break the fourth wall. The issue with this kind of introduction is that it leaves very little to surprise the audience with. It basically tells the audience what's going to be the grand culmination, and then not subvert their expectations with any twists or revelations. It's a fine way to non-diegetically introduce a character while having its own complications if not done right. But let's be real, that's the risk we take in storytelling. And these are narrative-based character introductions within the main story themselves to the audience. But there's more to an introduction that can be communicated to an audience with more than just their narrative role. What a character does with movement, motion, or interaction can convey a lot more about the character in their introduction than the dialogue of the character themselves. Actors and animators even try to experiment with character movement to get an idea of how the character's body language might differ from one another, and the quirks of how they might do certain simple movements can give a good grasp of their personality and their daily lives. During pre-production of Big Hero 6, the animators were given a task that seems pretty simple, but is actually fairly challenging. Each major character has to enter a coffee shop and take a seat. Yes, that's all they had to do. Enter and sit. Whether or not you're an animator, that sounds simple, but there's a lot more complex moving pieces to it than we might expect. How does the character interact with this given environment? How do they walk? What emotions do they have when they enter and take a seat? Do they do anything before or after some sort of performance? Where do they choose to sit? How do they sit? Do they have any props to interact with that aren't in this specific environment? What props will they use that fits their character? The list of considerations goes on. And the final versions that fit the vibe of the characters gave a clear idea of how these characters interact with the world and how to cleanly portray them in the film. In these animation tests, Heroes focus on his phone and throws his bag onto the table, dragging a chair to sit on and kick his legs up, all without taking his eyes off of it. Gogo runs up to the door, spins a chair around, and blows bubblegum. And Cass has her hands full with a box of dishes and uses her butt to open the cafe door, and then her leg to close it to then sit cross-legged in the chair. Honey Lemon opens the cafe door and gets so excited she forgets to close it as she places her bag down and crosses her legs. Baymax takes his time to sit to avoid bumping into anything and ends up accidentally causing a mess when he tries to stand up. This is a form of character introduction to an audience to get a good grasp of who these characters are. They're less than 30 seconds with no dialogue, because the motion and movement is far more necessary to experiment for an animated film than dialogue for the purposes of exploring body language. So non-diegetic character introduction has the benefit of conveying to the audience who the character is at the very core when they're alone without any consequences to the story. But a diegetic character introduction will progress the story because of the interactions that can actually affect the story itself. This lets a creator play around with the knowledge they give the audience and the knowledge the characters have. Procedural stories like Columbo or the Knives Out movies will introduce a wide array of characters for the film or the episode to create suspects for a mystery that's occurred. Columbo will specifically tell the audience who done it, and it's about Columbo putting the pieces together to lock them up for good. The audiences are the ones introduced to who done it, but the characters aren't aware of it. This introduction builds suspense and creates tension. There's someone who's committed a crime right there before Columbo's very eyes, but the audience screaming at their screen isn't gonna make any difference because Columbo can't hear them. This is an example of Alfred Hitchcock's famous analogy of the bomb under the table for crafting tension. If a creator shows the characters going about their lives and the bomb suddenly goes off, the audience is momentarily disoriented in shock before reorienting themselves to re-engage and question with the purpose of the bomb coming out of nowhere. But if the audience is told there's a bomb under the table and it goes off in a minute, the audience is tense in anticipation for that 1 minute as they have information or event that the characters don't have up until the bomb is resolved. The bomb, in the case of the character introductions, doesn't have to be literal, but a piece of information that's only been conveyed to the audience. An impressionable character our protagonists have saved from the antagonist might actually be a traitor, and them being saved was just a plan on the antagonist's end to have a leg up on our protagonists. Betrayal plots get juicy when an audience knows what's up. This level of anticipation is specific for the audience who's sort of taking an omniscient view of all the pieces and watching them fall into place. The audience can be non-diegetically introduced to a character, one that's been a key piece to the core story through a show's theme song or opening. This further builds the anticipation of an extremely important element to the narrative. Their non-diegetic introduction starts off as ominous and terrifying, but upon their formal introduction, they can be sweet and fun to be around. This will specifically contrast these two ideas of the non-diegetic clues and hints the audience has in comparison to the actual personality of the character we get to know, creating subtle tension. And this can bring up a point about how characters or audiences can be introduced to a character before their actual in-story appearance. Diegetically, a character could talk about another and it's a form of an introduction. They talk about the other character to someone who's never met them before. It can tell a lot to the unaware character about this person who the other character's known for a while, and non-diegetically communicates the same ideas to the audience. This diegetic introduction can also characterize the focal character to both the unaware character and the audience about what impression the mentioned character has on the focal character. It gives us an impression of and slight hints about what to expect when meeting this character. It's a similar thing about the Dreaded we talked about earlier, but in this case, it's the hints and clues that build up to a character rather than a pre-established knowledge that the character acts on. To avoid the audience from getting too confused with a lot of information being thrown at them, or a base story lacking the initial structure of either a very high concept or a confusing world, audience will often use an audience circuit, or as TV Tropes calls it, the Watson. The Watson will ask questions and seek answers that an audience might experience, named after Dr. John Watson of the Sherlock Holmes stories. It's a way for the story to diegetically communicate ideas that the audience would have and allows the audience to process through the information of various different types of introductions in the same way as this character, who also has absolutely no clue about this new world they're experiencing. In the exploration of character movement, characters might diegetically interact with one another as part of a short introduction to the audience. The Amazing Digital Circus has short character spotlight clips where we see what each of the characters do when interacting with one another. Ragatha waves at the camera as a butcher knife gets thrown at her head, but she's totally fine, just another day of shenanigans as she brushes it off. Jax's introduction is him tripping Ragatha and acting coy. We don't have a clue who threw the knife at Ragatha, but based on Jax's introduction, we assume it was him. Gangle waves but gets pushed by Jax's hand, breaking her comedy mask. This introduction to the characters conveys a lot about the tone, the character dynamic, and the movement of these characters, especially with Jax, who we assume is the most of a nuisance to our other main characters. A character already well established within the history of stories, who is then having a fresh exploration in a spin-off or adaptation, often means they have to diegetically hit certain beats for their exploration to be identical as the initial character. So, a creator has to identify what events are non-negotiable to make this character who they are, and what elements they can play around with to make the story feel fresh and yet convey the same core narrative, all of which has to be made clear in the character's introduction. And another consideration the creator must have when freshly exploring a pre-established character is their character design. What parts of this character can the creator play around with and explore? And by introducing the character outside of their most iconic design, it can actually give a clear trajectory for how their character development and the achievement of their iconic design can be interlinked to become the pre-established character. A character introduced outside of their established design and quickly achieving their iconic look means they've achieved the aesthetic part of their character, but not necessarily the actual personality itself. The iconic design can cause a very compelling disconnect between the brave hero who's doing good against a stumbling civilian who's trying to figure out what this role they put themselves into means for their daily life. But if achieving set design is put off for long enough, it can actually build up the anticipation to them achieving their look and introducing us to the character that is pre-established. If a version of the pre-established character already exists diegetically in the story, it can make the subsequent character we're introduced to have incredible pressure and expectation put upon them to live up to the character that once existed in this role. The pressure is especially more forceful if the pre-established character is no longer there, either dead or having to walk off into the sunset. If the pre-established character doesn't diegetically exist in the world, the character has the freedom to explore their own path and have various different diegetic design attempts to figure out who they are and what they stand for. The character, unsure about who they are, will deal with balancing who they are now and the demands of who they will have to become in order to find a balance of the pre-established character. And only upon finding this balance can they achieve their iconic design. It really makes it feel like an accomplishment the character does, only because of the audience's foreknowledge of the character to then be introduced to. But this diegetic and non-diegetic disconnect between the audience and the story can cause frustration in the audience. If a character's introduction conveys a dashing and charismatic persona that's sincere, and has the character not diegetically observed by anyone and acts in the same way, it'll firmly establish to the audience that this character is the same person alone and with others. But if the story reveals this character to be antagonistic all along, it can make the audience feel deceived by the story for a third act villain reveal. When the story has explicitly shown the audience this character acts sincerely to our protagonist when not observed by any narratively important characters. And this exploration between the non-diegetic foreknowledge of people in reality observing the narrative and the diegetic knowledge the character has is something that often happens in tabletop games. The players are forming their characters to not only work alone, but work together as part of their team. So the players will talk to each other when creating their characters to establish what role each one will play. A tabletop game will have social encounters, so it's important to have someone who can roll with a high charisma stat. They're going to get into combat, so optimizing for survivability and dealing damage is going to be an important consideration. And if things get really bad, the party's going to need someone that can use that spell or that one ability which gets the player characters healed up. But diegetically, the player characters are far more likely not to know each other and then introduce themselves. The players will very likely know what role each of these characters will play within the dynamic of the party, but not who these characters are themselves. We know that one player is going for druid vibes to morph into other animals, and we know how their mechanics work. But what's their story? How did they become who they are? There are many ways to play a druid, but what kind of story does this player want to tell in this world with this character? how will their mechanical abilities and party role affect the dynamics and connections to the rest of the group? Even if ultimately the players do explain most of who the character is, the player or audience is very unlikely to understand the choices or personality of the characters until the player roleplays them with their real-time performance, which then just builds up the other player's non-diegetic anticipation to diegetically interact with the other player's characters with their own character. It's a non-diegetic anticipation that's often baked into the beginning of pretty much every TTRPG campaign. And the one show that captures this anticipation excellently is the Mighty Nein animated series. The Mighty Nein is an adaptation of the second Dungeons & Dragons TTRPG campaign of Critical Role by the same name. Its predecessor animated series, The Legend of Vox Machina, was based on their first campaign. It had all of our characters know of each other and already worked through some adventures together already. No need to introduce themselves diegetically to each other because in the actual campaign, the game had started and then became a live-streamed actual play. The Mighty Nein was a campaign that formed with the foreknowledge of being specifically made for a live performance actual play, so the characters and the navigation of the narrative takes the exploration in a far more intentional direction than Vox Machina. I haven't seen either campaign, so I'm fully talking based on what I've heard and read about it. But whether the audience is familiar with the live streams of the Tabletop campaign, or a fresh view with not even the vaguest understanding of why these roles are critical and why these nines be mightying, the show builds up the non-diegetic anticipation of the various character introductions. So, spoiler warning for the first 3 episodes of the Mighty Nein animated series and the premiere of Critical Role Campaign 2. The first 2 episodes of the animated series act as a prologue. It didn't diegetically happen in the campaign's premiere. All 7 of the Mighty Nein met in a tavern, and then progressed forward from there to the events of the Fletchling and Moondruff traveling carnival of curiosities. The characters have little to no association with the carnival before the encounter. They just rock up to hook into the performance just to get attacked by the zombies they're supposed to be investigating. The way the animated series develops these characters before their collective character introduction builds anticipation for personal missions, creates conflict of interest in the protagonists we're attached to, and dooms the mass destruction that occurs in the carnival in the cold open of episode 3. By the end of the episode, all of our protagonists will be in the same place at the same time dealing with the same encounter. It's only a matter of time. But let's first get there. Based on the promotional material for the Mighty Nein, we know what the core cast of characters look like. There's 7 of them in total, and to a first-time viewer, they're the ones we have to look out for. The show opens on an odd death ritual occurring with some people, and a group of thieves stealing the artifact used for that ritual in an intense chase sequence. None of these characters are characters who we recognize from the promotional material, so the audience questions who's in the right here. Is it the thieves saving the world from this powerful device staying in the wrong hands, or is it the device's people, who are rightfully peeved that the thieves for stealing an important artifact of theirs? We do eventually find out within the first 3 episodes that they're both antagonists, but the thieves are the ones in the wrong here. And then we get to our main characters of the Mighty Nein and how they're introduced. In episode 1, 4 of the 9 are introduced to us. Caleb, the wettest and saddest man I've ever witnessed, crosses paths with Not the Brave, an alcoholic goblin woman with some issues and a lust for gold. Not steals some possessions from Caleb, and Caleb corners her to get it back. Not, having experienced sympathy for the very sad man, makes a deal. She'll help him if he helps her. Not debates turning on Caleb until she realizes he just wants his cat back, a companionship he really misses. So Not ventures forth with Caleb sincerely. Separately, the audience meets Bo, a monk who's discovered the monastic order they've dedicated themselves to are actually compromised in their values, and sets herself on the mission to topple it. She's sent by an undercover agent to retrieve an item of importance from a contact. The audience at the end of the episode is introduced to Yasha, a barbarian who kills a bunch of our antagonist guards. While the audience doesn't know much about Yasha besides her being cool as hell, we sympathize with Caleb, Not, and Bo because of their heavy focus of the episode. Yasha is a tease to be introduced to the main story. Even without the foreshadowing of the campaign, the narrator's emphasis on these characters are building the anticipation of bringing them together. In episode 2, we meet Ford, a half-orc sailor and the only survivor of the blown-up ship after being betrayed by another crewmate and accidentally becoming subservient to some kind of eldritch sea monster. He also developed magical powers that he's never had before, so we can guess its origins. In the same episode, we meet Jester, a blue tiefling who really likes talking to this maybe imaginary being she calls the Traveler and loves to play pranks with, until one of her pranks gets too real and she has to flee her home with Ford, who was just kind of passing through. Her introduction to Ford was bumping into him when guards are chasing her. He kindly apologized for bumping into her, fully unaware of the tomfoolery that's about to follow, and the audience becomes well aware this is a meet cute because of the non-diegetic pink background and flowers that appear around Ford. It implies that Jester is attracted to Ford upon their introduction. Remember that thing about staging I mentioned? We become sympathetic to both of them because of their relationships to the people they know and trust, or the people they once trusted that are now gone. Meanwhile, Caleb and Not travel and have quite a few heart-to-hearts and accidentally set Bo's horse free, angering her. Then we actually get to episode 3, where the audience is introduced to the last of the Mighty Nine, Molly Mock, or Molly for short. Since this episode has to do a lot, it starts with navigating Molly through the carnival, interacting and having good relationships with every performer or worker there. They're all one big happy family, but not in a hostile way. They care for each other and clearly have good history with one another, as Molly empathizes with them and makes them feel good. Even when he's encountering someone for the first time who needs help he can't accurately provide, he guides them to who might be better suited for helping. He needs today's performance to go off without a hitch and a full house, or the carnival's doomed. A number of our pre-established characters are moving around the carnival with their paths not intersecting. Caleb and Nod are trying to snatch up some decently guarded rare bugs stocked up to let Caleb do a ritual. Bo is to meet the informant at the carnival to get a pearl with information on her monastic order. Everything for Bo's plotline so far hinges on this pearl. Then Bo gets kicked out after confronting Caleb and Nod about the horse thing, and Nod steals her pearl. Could a first impression get any worse? Ford and Jester have a couple of heart-to-hearts and develop their bond closer. They're the only ones who have no real narrative stake in the carnival, so instead it's more of a curiosity from Jester that Ford can't really say no to. The only character that interacted with all of these characters each is Molly. He encounters Bo and is cautiously intrigued by her lone wolf vibes, until he has to kick her out for causing a fuss and apologizing to Nod and Caleb, then saving Jester and Ford from a couple of intense orcs to then invite them to the carnival. It's all coming together in this one place, with the foreknowledge of the doom that's about to descend to a pretty joyous collection of people, and the non-diegetic anticipation that the Six and Yasha will be forming a team together. Caleb and Nod pull out their heist with a couple of hitches along the way, but Bo sneaks in and decks them, which causes the aforementioned shenanigans to ensue, including Jester and the mouth of a giant frog creature that goes out of control. The Nine are the ones to stand up to the frog and the zombies it creates, but they're each unaware of each other and what they can or can't do, especially Caleb and Bo with Ford and Jester, which is how Ford tumbling into Caleb sets the whole carnival tent on fire. Through this episode and by the end, the audience has gotten to know each of the characters, their motivations, their behaviors, and what their specialty is. Our protagonists have briefly encountered a few of each other on one-on-one, but now that they're all in one place and equally suspects in the destruction of the carnival, they can connect with each other as a team. The only character that hasn't diegetically appeared in the team is Yasha, who's somewhere, but she's another Chekhov's gun. She has to interact with the team, but the anticipation of her diegetic introduction to the team is a hook for the rest of the season. When will all 7 of the 9 finally come together? It's only a matter of time. Okay, so the thing about introductions is that for how important they are, they're pretty low stakes, so the creator has to make events occur where there's not the time or the liberty for a character to freely introduce themselves, especially if they made a bad first impression. But the thing is, we've all gone through our own paths in lives, and we're different because of what we've experienced and how we respond to events happening in our lives. It doesn't matter how someone does on their first step. They've climbed a mountain to be where they are now that we haven't seen. We allow for fictitious characters to have the liberty of making an effort to clear up misunderstandings, so it's also important for us to extend that to the people around us. The creator has to convince us there's a whole history they've experienced that we weren't there for, but we don't often consider how they got to be the character they are now. As interesting as they are in the beginning of the story, we believe they've had a past that will change how they interact with the world around them, or make a change to the world beyond what the character themselves or the audience might realize, when the actual reality is that there's nothing more going on than what the creator wants to show. What we experience as the audience is actually the one direction the story has chosen to explore. A lot rides on how a character is introduced, since it's very easy to contradict or be unclear about certain choices that character makes doesn't align from how they were initially introduced, which can cause a disconnect between the audiences and the story. So when a character is supposed to get introduced for the first time, it's clear where we want an introduction to go well, even if it's as inconsequential as becoming acquainted with someone for the first time. It's an attempt to respect their experiences in the past that were part of making them who they are now, and allowing each other to play a role in each other's lives, regardless of how large or unimpactful our or their presence might be. Even if we've already had an introduction, it's nice to properly introduce ourselves to make sure we know who the people around us are, whether it's for a first time or for a fresh start. We might only ever get to introduce ourselves once, but once an introduction's done, it's all about getting to know them one detail at a time. So, even if you've seen another video of mine, or this is the first of my videos you're watching, let me introduce myself. Hi, I'm Sid. I make videos, and this is my channel. I talk a lot about animation, whether that's film, TV, or games, and how animation and stories can work together to create an impact beyond tangible moving image mediums like live action. I hope you enjoyed this video, my other videos, and I hope you enjoy the more that's to come. And that's all I gotta say. See ya!